it may not seem like the right thing in the moment, or my immediate gratification might not be served by this, but the Constitution gives me the authority to do, what I think might be necessary for us in 40 years or 50 years. And so that pardon story is an interesting part. I think it reaffirms the whole thing about the Constitution sort of made Jerry Ford, sort of buttressed him, I guess, even when his instincts would say, I'm not going there.
Hi, this is Tony Williams, Senior Fellow at BRI, and we're pleased to bring you another episode of Scholar Talks. For this episode, we're honored to have on scholar Alex Hindman, who is going to talk about his book, Gerald Ford and the Separation of Powers, Preserving the Constitutional Presidency in the Post-Watergate Period, as part of our American Presidency series. So the guiding question for this series is, what are the constitutional powers and also the limits of the American presidency? And Dr. Alex Hindman is an assistant professor of political science at the College of the Holy Cross, where he teaches classes on American ideas and institutions, constitutional law, Western political thought, and American political development, among others. He has written for a variety of scholarly and popular publications, and Gerald Ford and the Separation of Powers is his first book, and he's done a lot of great programs for us. The teachers love him, and thank you so much for all you do, Alex, and welcome.
Thank you so much for having me, Tony. This is really great to get a chance to talk with you a little bit.
Yeah, great, thanks. I love this book, right? It's kind of answering some questions I've had for a long time about Richard Nixon and sort of what's popularly called the imperial presidency. Sure. And so when he resigns under threat of impeachment and removal from office, what happens to the president? Some have suggested, I think, even sort of an imperial Congress, or certainly a resurgent Congress in a lot of ways. And so I love your book. Really pointed out sort of a, maybe a lesser known period. Gerald Ford, we have sort of a superficial maybe understanding of him, but how does he restore that strong presidency after, while he's in office after Watergate? So let's jump into the questions here. So Ford, obviously, as we just mentioned, faces some profound challenges in the wake of Richard Nixon and his resignation after Watergate. There's a lot of distrust of the presidency. There's a resurgent Congress. So what challenges does he face to head off, if you will, some of those attempts to limit presidential power in the wake of all of that?
Sure. No, I think this is a great way to sort of start it. I mean, the striking thing you mentioned at the top is this is kind of an odd period in American history. We look in many ways at the Ford presidency as sort of the coda on Richard Nixon. And then we move on, and maybe we do a little bit of malaise in Jimmy Carter, and then it's off to morning in America. And I'm always struck by that. So the pardon happened in the first part of Ford's term, and then a lot of scholars have forgotten about the other 895 days he was president. And so that's kind of what drew me to him. I thought, and you mentioned about the imperial presidency, we talk a lot about imperial presidents, but I felt like this is kind of the reverse case, right? In many ways, Jerry Ford is an imperiled president. What we know a lot about when presidents are trying to push the bounds of their power, but what about those cases when their backs are against the wall? To your question about the limits, I think in the things that he confronted, I mean, when you line up the challenges, I don't think there's another modern president that has more of them. The war in Vietnam, although U.S. combat forces were out of Vietnam, largely wound down in '72 under Nixon, but we still had a lot of U.S. power, a lot of diplomats, a lot of folks still on the ground in Vietnam. Gerald Ford had to figure out a way to wind that the rest of the way down. You had an economy that was increasingly having real problems. Stagflation was starting to go on the rise. Oil jumped. We're in a bit of an oil blip right now. But during that time, in less than a year, oil went from, imagine a crazy time to think about now, but $1.77 a barrel to $10 a barrel during that period. So you had this massive increase in the economy. And all of these things are sort of weighing down on the outside. Not even thinking about Richard Nixon and sort of the difficulties of what do you do with his co-conspirators. Is he going to be prosecuted now that he's a private citizen? All of these factors are sort of pushing on Ford. And then Ford sort of steps in it by doing the pardon too. And so overnight, his public approval ratings collapsed by about 40%. I mean, that's a remarkable thing. It's the largest drop in the Gallup poll that they had had to that time. And so he saps all of his political capital. So by any of the measures that we used to look at the bully pulpit, right, and TR and kind of driving that personality, popularity thing, he has none of that. And so I guess my argument at the end of the day is that what he does is he puts on that vest of the Constitution and says, you know, I may not be your favorite guy. You may have a lot of skepticism. I think Steve Knott talks about this in his book, that Doug Brinkley mentions that he's like more like a Rotary guy, like the local suburban dad that you want to have, you know, help clean out the gutters at the house. And nonetheless, the Constitution, when he vests himself in that makes him able to survive and have a moderately, you know, decent presidency. So.
Great. You know, you mentioned exiting a war, rising oil prices, stagflation, falling Gallup poll numbers. Sounds kind of like current events, I guess.
Crazy in many ways. I mean, these like, you know, I mean, all of these historical moments, you have these odd parallels. You're like, wait a second, I think we've seen this movie before. It's this odd deja vu. Yeah.
Right. So, and you mentioned it already in passing, but perhaps the best known action of President Ford was his pardon of Nixon. So can you tell us a little bit about that controversial decision and maybe your assessment of it?
Yeah, no, it was fascinating. I mean, it's one of these things. I think Ford was a Republican, sort of a loyal Republican for Richard Nixon for a while, and kind of came to office in an odd way. Sort of Spiro Agnew was forced out in 73 in the same month. So it was in the same month as the Saturday Night Massacre, and all of these other sort of weird events. The Arab Israeli conflict was happening in October of 73. So all of this stuff is moving. And Ford's sort of plopped into office. So Watergate kind of dominates his whole vice presidential period. And you see this weird kind of game where Ford is trying to be a loyal Republican on the one hand, and he sort of smells a rat in terms of how the, you know, Watergate's starting to unravel. By the time we get to, you know, mid-June, late July, definitely when the Supreme Court decision comes down in 74, Ford's like, this is clearly, you know, Nixon's clearly done. I have to start preparing for the vice presidency, or for the presidency, to assume the presidency. And then for about a month, so Ford comes into office the first part of August 9th of 74. And then for that first month, he's just constantly dealing with questions from the press. What do we do with Nixon? How do we deal with, you know, all of the ongoing prosecution? What are you doing about all the papers that are still there? And Ford, I think, personally became really tired of dealing with all that. He said, look, we got this economic problem, we got international events, we have to do something to move Nixon off the front page. And I think that's what motivated him to maybe make the move. And at the same time, he knew he was going to be, you know, tying himself down. So the striking thing to me is he said, I have to do this, that sense of duty. I've got to move it off the front page so we can get on with things. He bit the bullet and did it. Only told 5 people that he was thinking about it before it happened, and sort of dropped it on the nation on a Sunday morning, which is like completely PR people would have this is the horrible way to do this. And then he never regretted what he did, but you could sense that he always felt it was the right thing to do. But at the same time, there was a part of him that was saddened by the fact that it had to be done. And it wasn't until he got the Profile and Courage Award in 2001 from one of his most, you know, vociferous critics during the period, Ted Kennedy, that he started to say, you know what, maybe he felt vindicated in his choice later in life. So there's a neat story, there's a neat arc there, where you do the right thing in the moment, even, you know, you bear the tremendous cost. And at the end of his life, he felt that he was on the right side on this stuff. So I generally think it was the right move, but you know, it's at the time it was horrid. I mean, it had that horrid kind of effect.
Right. And just a quick follow-up. I mean, it's really fascinating, right? So is this a part, would you say, I think as some others have argued, that this is part of sort of national healing and kind of going through that process rather than seeing a president not only removed from office but in jail. So things could have gone very differently with this whole thing.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. I mean, almost immediately, and sort of, I guess, probably like the second or third week of August, Ford had sent Benton Becker was a prominent lawyer that worked in the Ford Nixon Justice Department administration, and he sent him out to go meet with Nixon in California. And there were real threats that Nixon's health was declining under the stress of Watergate, and there were some questions and some rumors about Nixon potentially taking his own life. And the idea that a country and the press sort of frenzy that's around a president might cost a president his life, I think caused Ford to say, this is not what's right for the country in the long run. And I think that gives a nice teachable lesson about what the Constitution does for presidents. You know, it may not seem like the right thing in the moment, or my immediate gratification might not be served by this, but the Constitution gives me the authority to do, you know, what I think might be necessary for us in 40 years or 50 years. And so that pardon story is an interesting part. I think it reaffirms the whole thing about the Constitution sort of made Jerry Ford, sort of buttressed him, I guess, even when his instincts would say, you know, I'm not going there.
I didn't know that, so I'm learning.
Okay, I hope so.
Along
it's
the
fun
way.
to get a chance. Yeah, it's nice to talk with people about it for sure.
Right. Now Congress attempted to restrain the president's expansive war powers with the War Powers Resolution, especially in the wake of Vietnam and the very difficult war that America had just been through. So how does Ford respond? Because I think this helps give us some lens into his use of the Constitution and separation of powers.
Yeah. So I think this is where it's interesting. Ford was very much a man of the House. So he was always a man of the House of Representatives. And he had advocated for legislative restrictions on presidential power throughout his term in Congress. So he in the mid 60s, when LBJ was starting to ramp up Vietnam, you have all of these statements from Ford as the minority leader in the House, where he's sort of saying, maybe we should need to restrain this imperial instinct on the part of presidents. And so he's inclined, I think, by the time he becomes president, to try and figure out a way to make Congress a good working partner. He calls it I want a good marriage with Congress in his sort of pseudo-inaugural joint session address. But he quickly finds that institutionally, the institutional design of the Congress and the presidency make it difficult as a workable policy as his term progresses. And so in that context, I think he quickly sees why the Constitution makes the president a singular office with one person to make these hard decisions. So we're all on the same page when it comes to, you know, making questions of military force or diplomacy. So in the book, I talk about 3 basic episodes of this. There's 4 days after he takes office, there's a Cypriot civil war between a Greek faction in Cyprus and a Turkish faction in Cyprus. And they sort of come to blows, and Ford, thinking he can let Congress take the lead, goes to Congress and he says, hey, can you help me formulate a policy? And they give him crickets because of domestic politics between the Greek sort of Hellenic American lobby community. And he realizes he just can't rely on Congress to give him the guidance that he would need. And so you get to the fall of Saigon, sort of, 4 or 5 months later, and the same thing happens. He finds that there's 2 members of Congress are in China. They're all on their Easter break when Saigon falls. And so everybody's spread out all over the place. And he says, I tried to call them, I tried to convene them, and they're like, Jerry, whatever you want to do, go ahead, knock yourself out. And so they're willing to cast the responsibility to the presidency. So after Saigon, after the fall of Cambodia, after Cyprus, he says, you know what, these guys, while on paper they want to be involved, institutionally, the instinct just isn't there. We just can't get our act together. And so later on, by the time you get to that sort of early spring of 75, he becomes much more self-confident in the need to be a president and order troops into hazardous circumstances to act, all while paying lip service to the War Powers Resolution. So he'll bring members of Congress in and he'll say, you know what, consistent with my wish to make sure Congress is informed. He never says in compliance with the War Powers Resolution. And I think that model sets the pattern for every subsequent president, all the way through Bill Clinton, Barack Obama, all of these folks who've sort of paid tacit attention to the War Powers Resolution because it is a valid law, right? But at the same time, found wiggle room within what the meaning of the word consult is, right? And all of this stuff. So it's a really interesting episode. He's the first president to confront it. And sort of you see this kind of soft concessions where he can, but that becomes the pattern for every subsequent president as well. So it's really cool. It's a really cool episode.
Right, right, and as a follow-up, it really strikes me that Ford is running a Hamiltonian presidency, right? I'm thinking of the Federalist Paper 70, 71, just acting with energy and dispatch, and in a way that you were alluding to, Congress really can't.
Yeah, and you're a great Hamiltonian guy yourself. You've got a great book on that too. The thing about it is I found that Ford channeled Hamilton. So if you want a modern example of Hamiltonian arguments, they're sort of couched in the aw shucks sort of Western Michigan, Grand Rapids way, but so it doesn't read like the Federalist Papers, but he has that kind of his public messages. It's all right out of Fed 70, the pardon out of Fed 74, Fed 72 on duration and the veto, like all of these pieces, you can see them kind of working their way out in the Ford presidency. He had a scholar in-house that worked for him by the name of Robert Goldwyn. And we found in going through his notes, he has a marked up copy of the Federalist Papers, and in the record where he briefed President Ford on, hey, you know this Alexander Hamilton guy? He had something for you here, and you should probably pay attention to the political teaching of the Federalist. And so it's an interesting way he connects that up. After Ford left office in 1977, he gave a great speech, the John Sherman Cooper lectures at the University of Kentucky. I think it's April of 77, where he walks through effectively Federalist 70, but in terms that are updated for the times. Like, I couldn't count on Congress in the context of the War Powers Resolution. They were all out of town. I was concerned about telling them things they might tell the press. Like, it goes through the whole reason. And for the rest of his life, he thought the War Powers Resolution was a terrible law because it constrained presidents when we want them. And that balance is a really important thing that I think his whole presidency teaches about the separation of powers. It's never, the president gets to decide or Congress gets to decide. It's always that kind of give and take, the pendulum, this balance that exists between both branches. So
right, great stuff. So next question is something I've always found interesting. Obviously the CIA, other intelligence services were sort of being raked over in the press for revelations of regime change and assassinations and abuses of power here in the United States. And so the Church and Pike committees launched these famous investigations to try to curtail, what we call "quote unquote" secret government, right? And so how and why did Ford seek to preserve presidential control over national security, and what were sort of the needs of secrecy in diplomacy?
Yeah, I mean, this is a good example of those recurring episodes we have in American history where we want Congress to be involved in these things, but it is historically a presidential kind of prerogative to engage in covert activity and push for these things. What had happened post World War II, and our friend Steve Knott knows a lot about this whole period, but he talks a lot about how members of Congress sort of authorized almost blank checks to the presidency to carry out covert action. And so this period was the first time Congress sort of acted like they were aware of it, I guess, that they became suddenly aware of the fact that we engage in activities abroad that are sort of covert and intelligence related. So Ford kind of confronted this reckoning, I guess, that we had over what we had done in the early stages of the Cold War. An important part of this was William Colby, the then director of the CIA, constructed and sort of put together this retrospective review, but then it got leaked to Seymour Hersh of the New York Times. And Hirsch published all of this in the New York Times and laid it all out. And immediately members of Congress who prior to the publication had heard about this happening, but acted sort of shocked, like, wow, this stuff is going on, and reacted in the same sort of fervor of Watergate to say, you know what, bad president, we need to rein this crazy thing in, and really sort of pushed to get at the abuses of the intelligence community. And so for the next sort of year and a half, maybe a year and 3 months, they sort of dredged up all of this stuff. There's pictures of senators pointing dart guns in the Senate, and they're sort of puzzled by this dart gun that was meant to go after Fidel Castro, poison cigars and things like this. So it was showy in a way that Congress does, but Ford worked with them because he respected the idea that Congress needs to hear these things and needs to know what's going on. And so they tried to work out a way in which documents were given, but the executive branch retained some control. And it got really messy over that next year. For Ford's part, he was really trying to protect sources and methods. So any of the stuff where you know a spy's name abroad. Well, somehow, not completely unrelated to the investigations, an American ambassador, an American diplomat, Richard Welch, was assassinated. And Ford used that sort of tactically to say, here's what happens when we disclose the identities of our people abroad. Here's why we need to reform the intelligence community. And again, he sort of found his voice to issue an executive order where he took it in-house and reframed all of the intelligence community down the line, because he believed he had the constitutional authority, even as Congress is telling him, no, it's our baby. We can kind of constrain the opportunity. It's an interesting episode where, again, they're constantly moving. So both branches are asserting their constitutional powers and at the same time operating in this fact-driven, what's released today, how do we deal with whatever's coming down the pike. And so that's a part of the story that I think is really fascinating too.
Right, good. And a big question, I know, but an important one sort of at the heart of your book. So you write that Ford preserved the constitutional presidency and quote, ensure that our constitutional system would persist, end quote. So what are the characteristics of that constitutional presidency, and what are the powers and limits of the office, as we asked in our main question here, and how does Ford preserve those powers and limits?
Yeah, no, and I think it's kind of all the things we've just sort of talked about a little bit. It strikes me that when it goes back to that idea that what do you do when you don't have the sort of political force of the office? Well, you have no choice but to go back to what is always there for presidents. From George Washington to Joe Biden, the essential constitutional powers of the office still remain. They can adapt, right? You can have a president that's really powerful post 9/11, that you want to be really powerful post 9/11. And you have a presidency that also goes back into a box at different moments when you don't want that, when you want democratic control. And that movement, I think, is sometimes lost on people who are sort of legal scholars, right? They just look at the text and, well, this is the determinant piece of the text. And so always presidents get to initiate conflict, or Congress always has to do this. And politically, it's a much more kind of flexible thing. And we want that, I guess. And so Ford, back to your question, how did Ford preserve it? Ford modeled politically how you operate a legal text in the Constitution. So there's always that flexibility in the hinges that allows the Constitution to adapt. And I guess where I get to at the end of the day, I say, the Constitution established this really resilient order. We have a really resilient system that has that capacity to move to fit political circumstances. Even when Ford's his weakest, he's saying, hey guys, this idea of the War Powers Resolution is really going to make it really hard for us to respond to foreign affairs. Here's how it could go poorly for us. Are we sure we want to go there? And it has that conversational quality. I think it's Walter Bagehot, the British constitutionalist. He says, we're built around a government by discussion. And both branches sort of put forward their constitutional arguments. and they're able to talk about it. But it's contingent on one branch not being able to completely bowl over the other. And Ford's time in office, I think, shows that even when they're weak, they still have that opportunity to participate as a self-governing society and providing a new perspective that the country may need to hear.
Alex, I can't thank you enough for joining us. I never thought I would say this, but I could sit and talk about Gerald Ford all day with you. So,
I didn't think I'd write a book on him either, so it worked out. It's surprising, he's a neat guy for sure.
Well, thanks for coming on. The book is Gerald Ford and the Separation of Powers. And I want to thank all of you for joining us for this episode of Scholar Talks. Please check out our other interviews in the series on the American presidency. And from our extensive library of interviews on the topic, including the Cold War and the Presidency series, Steve Knott on the Constitutional and Populist Presidency, and Sarah Burns on the Presidency and War Powers. Also, check out the highly popular BRI curriculum, Presidents and the Constitution. Thank you very much.